Hi again. In Richard Hofstadter's book Anti-intellectualism in American Life, Chapter 1, Anti-intellectualism in Our Time, of course our time being the post-World War II generation. Although this book deals mainly with certain aspects of the remoter American past, it was conceived in response to the political and intellectual conditions of the 1950s. During that decade, the term anti-intellectualism, only rarely heard before, became a familiar part of our national vocabulary of self-recrimination and intramural abuse. In the past, American intellectuals were often discouraged or embittered by the national disrespect for mind, but it is hard to recall a time when large numbers of people outside the intellectual community shared their concern, or when self-criticism on this count took on the character of a nationwide movement. Primarily it was McCarthyism which aroused the fear that the critical mind was at a ruinous discount in this country. Of course, intellectuals were not the only targets of McCarthy's constant detonations. He was after bigger game. But intellectuals were in the line of fire, and it seemed to give special rejoicing to his followers when they were hit. His sorties against intellectuals and universities were emulated throughout the country by a host of less exalted inquisitors. Then, in the atmosphere of fervent malice and humorless imbecility stirred up by McCarthy's barrage of accusations, the campaign of 1952 dramatized the contrast between intellect and Philistinism in the opposing candidates. On the one side was Adlai Stevenson, a politician of uncommon-minded style whose appeal to intellectuals overshadowed anything in recent history. On the other was Dwight D. Eisenhower, conventional in mind, relatively inarticulate, harnessed to the unpalatable Nixon, and waging a campaign whose tone seemed to be set less by the general himself than by his running mate and the McCarthyite wing of his party. Eisenhower's decisive victory was taken both by the intellectuals themselves and by their critics as a measure of their repudiation by America. Time, the weekly magazine of opinion, shook its head in an unconvincing imitation of concern. Eisenhower's victory, it said, quote, discloses an alarming fact long suspected: there is a wide and unhealthy gap between the American intellectuals and the people, unquote. Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., in a mordant protest written soon after the election, found the intellectual, quote, in a situation he has not known for a generation, unquote. After 20 years of democratic rule, during which the intellectual had been in the main understood and respected, business had come back into power, bringing with it the vulgarization which has been the almost invariable consequence of business supremacy. Now, the intellectual, dismissed as an egghead, an oddity, would be governed by a party which had little use for or understanding of him, and would be made the scapegoat for everything from the income tax to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Anti-intellectualism, Schlesinger remarked, has long been the anti-Semitism of the businessman. The intellectual is on the run today in American society, he said, end of quote. All this seemed to be amply justified when the new administration got underway. The replacement, in Stevenson's phrase, of the New Dealers by the car dealers seemed to make final the repudiation of intellectuals and their values. They had already been overshadowed by the courthouse politicians of the Truman years. The country was now treated to Charles E. Wilson's sallies at pure research, to stories about Eisenhower's fondness for Western fiction as reading matter, and to his definition of an intellectual as a wordy and pretentious man. But during the Eisenhower administration, the national mood reached a turning point. The McCarthyite rage, confronted by a Republican president, burned itself out. The senator from Wisconsin isolated himself, was censured, and deflated. Finally, in 1957, the launching of the Sputnik by the Soviets precipitated one of those periodic surges of self-conscious national reappraisal to which the American public is prone. The Sputnik was more than a shock to American national vanity. It brought an immense amount of attention to bear on the consequences of anti-intellectualism in the school system and in American life at large. Suddenly, the national distaste for intellect appeared to be not just a disgrace, but a hazard to survival. After assuming for some years that its main concern with teachers was to examine them for disloyalty, the nation now began to worry about their low salaries. Scientists, who had been saying for years that the growing obsession with security was demoralizing to research, suddenly found receptive listeners. Cries of protest against the slackness of American education, hitherto raised only by a small number of educational critics, were now taken up by television, mass magazines, businessmen, scientists, politicians, admirals, and university presidents, and soon swelled into a national chorus of self-reproach. Of course, all this did not immediately cause the vigilante mind to disappear, nor did it disperse anti-intellectualism as a force in American life. Even in the sphere most immediately affected, that of education, the ruling passion of the public seemed to be for producing more Sputniks, not for developing more intellect, and some of the new rhetoric about education almost suggested that gifted children were to be regarded as resources in the Cold War. But the atmosphere did change, notably. In 1952, only intellectuals seemed much disturbed by the specter of anti-intellectualism. By 1958, the idea that this might be an important and even a dangerous national failing was persuasive to most thinking people. Today, it is possible to look at the political culture of the 1950s with some detachment. Of course, he's writing from the angle of 1962. If there was a tendency to see in McCarthyism, and even in the Eisenhower administration, some apocalypse for intellectuals in public life, it is no longer possible now that Washington has again become so hospitable to Harvard professors and ex-Rhodes scholars. If there was a suspicion that intellect had become a hopeless obstacle to success in politics or administration, it must surely have been put to rest by the new president's obvious interest in ideas and respect for intellectuals. His ceremonial gestures to make that respect manifest in affairs of state, his pleasure in the company and advice of men of intellectual power, and above all by the long, careful search for distinguished talents with which his administration began. On the other hand, if there had ever been an excessive confidence that the recruitment of such talents would altogether transform the conduct of our affairs, time has surely brought its inevitable disenchantment. We have now reached the point at which intellectuals can discuss anti-intellectualism without exaggerated partisanship or self-pity. I'll put in a link to Page Smith, a historian who was, at the end of his life, wrote an interesting mini history of the United States. And here's something he said in that book about the Founding Fathers and how they thought that America would either stand or fail, how America would succeed or fail, according to the Founding Fathers. Next time we'll get back to the first chapter of Richard Hofstadter, Anti-intellectualism in Our Time. See you soon.